As Pastor Matthew aptly lamented last week, on behalf of all preachers and clergy in the month of August, every 3 years we have to preach for like 4 weeks on John. And if that's not, if it's not death by redundancy, we also have to admit that these word choices by Jesus in the 6th chapter of John are honestly really weird, if not disturbing. Here's what Jesus says in today's reading, just to make you feel even more comfortable. I'm going to repeat them. Very truly, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Friends, if we're going to have authentic faith, we can't sit here and pretend that that's a normal thing to say and hear, eating flesh and drinking blood. Martin Luther said that a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is. And if I'm going to try to be that, then I'm going to say that that line by Jesus in this chapter where Jesus speaks is. And if it isn't weird enough for you, look at the Greek. And I've lifted this up before on this text, so this may be a refresher for some of you who happened to be here in worship 3 years ago today. But look at the Greek, the original language in which the New Testament was written. Because, folks, what Jesus actually said is somehow even more bizarre. The verb that you see translated as eat in verse 54 isn't actually the common Greek verb for eat, which would be esthio. Instead, Jesus uses a stranger verb for eating. He says, those who trogon my flesh have life. And I can barely say this with a straight face, but the Greek word trogon means to chew. I know. It's gross. So a more accurate translation could be, those who chew my flesh have life. It's cringeworthy. In fact, even the disciples present to Jesus in this moment were startled by Jesus' phrasing. It's not in your reading today, but it's in verse 60, so moments later. It says, quote, when the disciples heard this, they said, this teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? Which I think is really polite of them. And this is to say, Jesus even freaked out his original and friendly audience. Not only that, likewise, later in Christian history, this language of flesh and blood, eating and drinking, would confuse and creep out even those living alongside Christian communities. According to historian William Plaker, early Christians worshiping in the Roman Empire, in some cases, had charges of cannibalism made against them by Roman authorities. Because of the liturgical and scriptural language of eating flesh, Roman authorities mistakenly thought that Christians were eating people. So the language was shockingly weird then, and it is shockingly weird now. And lest we awaken any concerns of governmental authorities over cannibalism, perhaps we should concede that Jesus is being metaphorical here. I think biblical literalism runs out of runway when it comes to John 6. At least I hope so. But Jesus certainly has our attention, doesn't he? What does consuming flesh, Jesus' flesh, mean? Again, Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, you have no life in you. Whoever eats or chews me, still hard, choose me will live because of me. If metaphorical, what is Jesus talking about when he says flesh? What is it that he does want us to chew on in order to have life? I think there are questions, and some scholars point to Jesus' death on the cross as the metaphor behind flesh here. One theologian, David Lose, argues that by talking about eating flesh and drinking blood, Jesus is actually pointing ahead to his own crucifixion, where his flesh will be stretched upon the cross freely for our sake. So Lose contends that when Jesus says to consume his flesh, he's provocatively pointing his listeners to his own death, a death that will display ultimately his love to a radical level. And it is that radical sacrificial love of Jesus' flesh and blood upon which we should feast upon the love that is displayed on the cross. And I think that's a beautiful way to understand what Jesus might mean here by flesh. And I think there's an additional direction you could go to understand what Jesus means by flesh here. Rather than going to the end of the gospel of John to Jesus' death, I think you could also go to the very beginning of the gospel to discern what Jesus might mean regarding flesh, this flesh that we're supposed to chew on. So now I want you to recall the very first words of the Gospel of John. They're some of John's most famous words. Sometimes they're read around Christmas. Recall the very first words of the Gospel of John. Quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was the light of all the people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And the Word became flesh, full of grace and truth." So Jesus' flesh is the Word. And what is the Word? The Word is God. The Word is light. The Word is grace upon grace. The Word is love. So when Jesus says, "Consume my flesh," perhaps Jesus means consume the Word. And what is the Word? According to John 1, it is light, it is grace, it is love. And God's light, grace, and love for us is to be our daily meal. So I want you to think of it this way. When you are feeling guilty and ashamed, filled with regret and embarrassment, perhaps Jesus is saying here in John 6, then make it your daily diet to remember that you are forgiven and you are beloved. Or maybe when you're anxious and scared, perhaps Jesus in John 6 here is saying, then make it your daily diet to remember that you are not alone. Or when you are feeling broken and empty and insecure, maybe Jesus in John 6 here is saying, then make it your daily diet to remember that you are a child of God, whom the creator of the entire universe thinks is worth dying for. Or maybe when you are not feeling enough, then maybe Jesus in John 6 here is saying, make it your daily diet to remember accepted. And no darkness can overcome that promise. No darkness can overcome the light of the promise that God so loved the world that the Word became flesh, not to condemn the world, but to save it and love it. Chew on that. Make it your daily diet to reflect on the light, grace, and love God always has for you, and it will give you life. Our spirits hunger for such sustenance, and Jesus is saying, I am the bread of life. The Word made flesh. Friends, dine on that promise every day. And then, go feed others. because this world also hungers for light, grace, and love. Amen.